Picture this. It's the winter of 1942. On the banks of the Volga River, an entire German army is slowly being crushed in a ruined city that barely exists anymore. Buildings are hollow shells, the air stinks of smoke and frozen corpses, and soldiers fight room to room, sometimes for a single staircase. This is Stalingrad, one of the deadliest battles in human history, where more people died than in many entire wars. But Stalingrad isn't just famous because it was brutal. It's famous because it was the moment attrition, sheer, grinding, industrial-scale exhaustion of men and resources finally turned the tide against Nazi Germany. In this video, we're going to break down how that happened. How did one city become the graveyard of Hitler's ambitions? How did the Red Army transform a near disaster into a decisive victory? And what does this teach us about modern war itself? Let's dig in. To understand why Stalingrad mattered so much, we first need a clear roadmap of what actually happened and what was at stake. In this video, we'll walk through the big picture, the strategic importance of the city, Hitler and Stalin's clashing decisions, the brutal street fighting, the Soviet counteroffensive, and the slow, suffocating encirclement that destroyed the German Sixth Army. We'll zoom in on ordinary soldiers and civilians, and zoom out to see how factories, railways, and even the weather shaped the outcome. By the end, you'll see why Stalingrad wasn't just another battle, but a giant pivot point that changed the direction of World War II. If you're into clear, story-driven history breakdowns like this, consider subscribing and tapping the notification bell so you don't miss future deep dives. And stick with me till the end. We'll wrap up with the key lessons this battle still offers today. By summer 1942, Nazi Germany was already deep inside the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, had smashed through Soviet defenses and inflicted staggering losses. But Hitler's dream of a quick victory had stalled outside Moscow in the winter of 1941-42. So in 1942, he shifted focus south. The goal: seize the oil of the Caucasus, the lifeblood of modern mechanized war. On the way stood a long industrial city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. Strategically, it was a major transport hub and industrial center for armaments and tractors. Symbolically, it carried Stalin's name. Hitler became obsessed with capturing it, both to cut Soviet logistics and to deliver a humiliating blow to his rival. What began as a supporting objective, a flank guard for the drive to the oil fields, morphed into a primary target. The German Sixth Army was ordered to take Stalingrad quickly. Instead, they were about to be swallowed by it. Why did everyone care so much about this one city? Strategically, Stalingrad anchored the Volga, a vital artery carrying oil, grain, and raw materials from the south to central Russia. Control that river and you choke a huge portion of Soviet logistics. The city's factories produced tractors and armaments. Even under bombardment, some kept turning out weapons. For Germany, taking Stalingrad would help shield the flank of forces pushing toward the Caucasus oil fields. But symbolism supercharged everything. A city named after Stalin was irresistible to Hitler's ego. Propaganda on both sides elevated Stalingrad into a test of national will. Who would break first? This mix of concrete strategic value and emotional obsession set the stage for a battle that made no sense on a cost-benefit spreadsheet, but made perfect sense to leaders willing to trade hundreds of thousands of lives for prestige and psychological victory. Once committed, neither side could back down without catastrophic loss of face. In late summer 1942, the German Sixth Army, supported by the 4th Panzer Army, reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. Before the infantry moved in, the Luftwaffe tried to bomb the city into submission. Massive air raids turned whole districts into smoking rubble, killing tens of thousands of civilians in days. Ironically, this destruction made Stalingrad easier to defend. Rubble, craters, and shattered buildings created natural fortifications. The Germans expected another fast victory like at Kiev or Minsk. Instead, they ran into a city that fought back on every block. Soviet command ordered that the Volga would not be crossed by the Germans. Reinforcements and supplies flowed over the river under constant air and artillery fire. Stalin issued Order No. 227, not a step back, and punishment units enforced it ruthlessly. The defenders were told the city must be held at any cost. The cost would soon be measured in tens of thousands of bodies on both sides. Urban combat in Stalingrad became something entirely different from the sweeping tank battles of the open steppe. Historians call it Rattenkrieg, rat war. Streets changed hands multiple times in a single day. A factory might be held by Germans on one floor, Soviets on another, and no man's land in the stairwells. Snipers stalked every window. Artillery barrages shifted piles of rubble without clearly clearing enemy positions. Famous strongpoints like Pavlov's house, an apartment block turned fortress, became symbols of Soviet resilience. But behind the legends was a grinding, almost mechanical butchery. Platoons were fed into attacks that gained a single building and lost half their men. Both sides learned to fight in 3 dimensions: basements, ground floors, and upper stories, often connected by holes blasted through walls. Tanks, so powerful in open terrain, were vulnerable here, ambushed at close range. Stalingrad turned into a giant meat grinder where traditional maneuver warfare simply dissolved. By October 1942, the German Sixth Army was deeply entangled in Stalingrad, bleeding manpower and ammunition, yet on the strategic map something dangerous was happening to their flanks. Because most German troops were concentrated in the city, the long front lines north and south of Stalingrad were held by weaker Allied forces. Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units with fewer anti-tank weapons and lower morale. Soviet High Command, Stavka, saw an opportunity. While German commanders obsessed over capturing the last Soviet positions by the river, Zhukov and Vasilevsky were quietly massing reserves on the steppe. Fresh armies, including powerful tank and cavalry formations, assembled out of sight. Soviet factories, relocated east earlier in the war, were now producing equipment at an astonishing rate. What looked like a desperate defense in the city was actually buying time for something much bigger. A massive double envelopment designed to cut off the entire Sixth Army from the rest of German forces. On November 19, 1942, the trap snapped shut. The Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a coordinated double offensive aimed not at the city itself, but at the weaker Axis flanks. In the north, Soviet forces smashed through Romanian lines with tanks and infantry, exploiting poor equipment and thin defenses. The next day, a southern offensive ripped open Romanian positions below Stalingrad. German High Command was slow to grasp the scale of the danger, assuming this was a limited attack. But Soviet spearheads drove rapidly westward, swinging around like giant pincers. On November 23rd, near the town of Kalach, the northern and southern Soviet forces linked up. A vast pocket had been formed around Stalingrad. Inside it, around 250,000 Axis troops, mostly the German Sixth Army and parts of the Fourth Panzer Army. What had been a grinding urban offensive suddenly turned into a massive encirclement. The hunters had become the hunted trapped deep inside hostile territory. Once encircled, the Sixth Army faced a stark choice: attempt to break out while they still had fuel and cohesion, or dig in and hope for relief. Frontline commanders like General Paulus hesitated, caught between military logic and Hitler's direct orders. Hitler declared Stalingrad a fortress to be held at all costs, promising a relief offensive and a massive airlift to keep the army supplied. The Luftwaffe claimed it could deliver about 300 tons of supplies per day. In reality, it managed less than a third of that, often far less due to weather and Soviet fighters. Fuel, food, and ammunition dwindled. Horses were slaughtered for meat. Medical supplies ran out. The chance for an early breakout, when German units still had mobility, slipped away. By obeying the order to stay, the Sixth Army effectively traded short-term discipline for long-term annihilation. Attrition was no longer an abstract concept. It was hunger, frostbite, and empty ammunition crates. As December 1942 turned into January 1943, conditions inside the pocket became nightmarish. Temperatures plunged well below freezing. German troops lacked proper winter gear, many still in lighter uniforms from summer. Soviet artillery and Katyusha rockets pounded positions relentlessly. Starvation hollowed out the army from within. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, often operating in unheated cellars. Wounded men froze to death on stretchers. Disease spread quickly in cramped, filthy shelters. Meanwhile, civilian survivors of the initial bombardments were trapped in the same hell, hiding in basements, bartering scraps of food, and scavenging firewood from ruins. The promised relief effort, Operation Winter Storm, advanced toward the pocket but stalled short of breaking through. Paulus was ordered not to attempt a link-up. With each passing day, the Sixth Army became less a fighting force and more a mass of exhausted, starving men trying to hold fragments of a dead city. Soviet forces tightened the ring shell by shell, street by street. By early 1943, the battle had shifted decisively. The Soviets recognized that their greatest weapon now wasn't just artillery or tanks, it was attrition. Every day the Sixth Army stayed encircled. It burned through precious supplies Germany couldn't replace. On the Eastern Front, Soviet industry relocated east of the Urals was reaching full output, replacing losses faster than Germany could. Stalin's generals launched further operations, like Saturn and Little Saturn, attacking other Axis positions and widening the strategic damage. German attempts to rescue Stalingrad weakened their broader front. The logic of attrition tilted toward the Soviets. They had more manpower, more industrial capacity, and shorter supply lines. The Germans were bleeding in a position they could no longer afford to hold. Stalingrad became less about the city itself and more about exhausting the enemy's ability to wage war. The tide of the Eastern Front was turning, one frozen, starving division at a time. On January 10, 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final phase to crush the pocket. After a heavy artillery barrage, they advanced systematically, slicing the surrounded area into smaller segments. German resistance was fierce in places, but increasingly fragmented. Units lacked ammunition. Some fired captured Soviet weapons or fought with grenades and submachine guns at point-blank range. Command and control began to break down. Paulus, promoted to field marshal in a last-ditch attempt by Hitler to stiffen his resolve, faced a symbolic choice. No German field marshal had ever surrendered, yet his army was disintegrating. On January 31st, Soviet troops reached his headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. A few days later, on February 2nd, the last organized resistance in the northern pocket ceased. Of roughly 250,000 encircled Axis troops, only about 90,000 went into captivity. Most would never see home again. The human cost of Stalingrad is almost beyond comprehension. Estimates vary, but total casualties, dead, wounded, captured, and missing, likely exceeded 2 million people on both sides, including hundreds of thousands of civilians. For Germany, the loss of the Sixth Army shattered the myth of invincibility. An entire experienced field army had been annihilated, taking with it irreplaceable officers, NCOs, and equipment. Morale on the home front sagged. For the first time, the Nazi regime had to publicly admit a major defeat. For the Soviet Union, victory came at a horrific price, but transformed national psychology. The Red Army had not just survived, it had destroyed a major German force and seized the strategic initiative. Axis allies, Romania, Italy, Hungary, lost faith in the war, their armies mauled on the steppe. From Stalingrad onward, Germany was mostly on the defensive in the east, slowly pushed back toward Berlin under a relentless, grinding Soviet advance. Putting it all together, Stalingrad shows how a battle can be decided less by brilliant maneuvers and more by who can endure and inflict attrition longer. Strategically, the city sat on a vital river and guarded access to oil, but it became far more than geography. Hitler's obsession turned a supporting objective into a death trap for 250,000 men. The Germans underestimated Soviet capacity to absorb punishment, rebuild their armies, and coordinate large-scale offensives. The Soviets learned to turn the enemy's strengths, fast offensives, and concentrated forces into vulnerabilities by attacking the weaker flanks and cutting supply lines. Inside the city, urban warfare erased many advantages of German tactics, favoring gritty, small-unit defense and close-quarters fighting. Stalingrad's outcome shifted the Eastern Front from German offensive to German defensive, with long-term consequences for the entire war. Above all, it demonstrates that in industrial warfare, logistics, production, and staying power can outweigh tactical brilliance. If you've made it this far, you now have a solid, step-by-step understanding of how Stalingrad became the turning point of the Eastern Front and a textbook case of attrition deciding a war. But this is just one chapter in a much bigger story of World War II strategy, leadership, and human endurance. If you want more deep dives like this, from Kursk to the Battle of Britain, or from Midway to the fall of Berlin, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll know when new episodes drop. It really helps this kind of long-form history content reach more people. Drop a comment with another battle or campaign you'd like to see broken down in this level of detail. And if you found this useful, consider sharing it with a friend who loves history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.